My wife mocked me at her SISTERS engagement party, but they didn't know I built this empire. You won't believe what happened at her sister's engagement party. She mocked me in front of everyone, but what she didn't know was that I had a secret, a game-changing surprise that would turn her smug laughter into stunned silence. Stick around to find out how I built my empire, and finally revealed the truth. You're in for a roller coaster of drama, betrayal, and one unforgettable twist. I can still remember the way it felt when I walked into that engagement party. I'd spent years working my ass off, chasing a dream I could barely afford to believe in. For the longest time, it felt like every step I took was met with another reason why I'd never make it. My wife, Alice, never said it outright, but I could see it in her eyes, hear it in her tone whenever I'd talk about my plans. She'd smile, nod, and then change the subject, like my words didn't matter. Her family wasn't any better. They saw me as a nobody, a guy who was never going to amount to anything. Her father, especially, would look at me with this subtle smirk, like he knew I was wasting my time. The first time I met him, I'd worn the best suit I could scrape together, shook his hand with all the confidence I could muster, and all he'd done was glance down at me like I was just another one of his daughter's temporary mistakes. That's the kind of weight I carried every single day, trying to convince myself that I had what it took to create something real, something that mattered. It wasn't like I didn't try to let them in on what I was doing. I'd tell Alice about the late nights I spent drafting blueprints and crunching numbers, or how I'd managed to secure a meeting with a local supplier. She'd listen, but I could tell her mind was somewhere else, probably on her sister Stacy's latest vacation, or the designer purse she'd been eyeing. The truth is, Alice loved the idea of stability, and I didn't have it. Not yet, anyway. I was the guy who kept chasing this so-called pipe dream, while she measured success by the cars our friends drove or the houses they posted on social media. I couldn't blame her for wanting those things, but it cut deep every time she looked at me like I was never going to be the one who could give them to her. And then there was Stacy. She was younger, sharper-tongued, and, frankly, meaner than Alice. Stacy always had a way of making me feel small. The kind of girl who'd walk into a room, scan it from top to bottom, and within a second, decide you weren't worth her time. She'd toss out these little comments, these sly digs that always hit their mark. "Still working on that restaurant thing?" she'd ask, smiling just enough to make it seem like she cared. "You know, it's really great you have a hobby." It made my stomach turn every time, but I swallowed my pride because, at the end of the day, I wasn't doing this for her, or for any of them. I was doing it for me. The truth is, the restaurant wasn't just some half-baked idea I'd come up with on a whim. It was my dream, my way out. I'd spent years studying the industry, learning from the ground up, and I knew in my gut that I had what it took to make it. I'd start with a small place, something local, something that felt like home. My food would be the kind of food that people would tell their friends about, the kind they'd crave on a bad day. But no one ever saw the work behind the dream. They didn't see the nights I came home too tired to talk, the mornings I woke up still wearing yesterday's clothes because I'd passed out at my desk. They didn't see the risks I was taking, or the fact that every dollar I made went right back into the project. They only saw what I didn't have yet: a shiny car, a big house, a name that mattered to people like them. Even as I walked into that engagement party, I could feel the weight of their expectations pressing down on me. Alice was buzzing with excitement, practically glowing as she talked about how her sister Stacy had landed the perfect guy. "Tony's a hedge fund manager," she said, her voice tinged with pride. "He's throwing the party at one of the best restaurants in the city." She was beaming, looking at me as if she expected me to be impressed. I just nodded and let her keep talking. Inside, my stomach churned. I didn't know how to tell her that the best restaurant in the city was my restaurant, the one I'd been building behind the scenes while she barely noticed. I'd kept it a secret because, frankly, I didn't need her negativity clouding what I'd worked so hard for. I didn't need her telling me it was a bad idea, or that I should have done something more practical. I wanted that moment when she'd finally see what I'd accomplished, and this was going to be that moment. I had imagined it 1,000 times. But now, standing there at the entrance to my own place, I felt something I hadn't expected: calm. For the first time in years, I wasn't nervous or unsure. I wasn't the guy trying to prove himself anymore. I was the guy who had already made it, and they just didn't know it yet. As we walked inside, Alice clutched my arm, pointing out the gorgeous decor, the shimmering chandeliers, the polished wood floors. "Isn't this place incredible?" she whispered. I nodded, biting back a smile. I could feel the irony hanging in the air. She had no idea. None of them did. Her father was already sitting at a table near the back, laughing with one of his business associates, probably talking about how proud he was of Stacy's new fiancée. Stacy herself was standing near the bar, drink in hand, scanning the room with that same look she always had, like she owned the place. They were all here, all laughing, all oblivious to the fact that the very space they were celebrating in was mine. I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I just stood there and let them enjoy their moment, knowing that when the truth came out, the room would feel a whole lot smaller. Sometimes, the best way to show someone who you are is to let them tell you who they think you aren't. And that's exactly what I planned to do. I had spent so long being the guy they looked past, the guy who wasn't enough. But tonight, they were about to learn exactly who I was. It wasn't long after we settled into the restaurant that I felt the familiar ache of my wife's indifference creeping back in. Alice wasn't a bad person. She wasn't mean or cruel in any overt way. She just didn't believe in me. Not really. At first, I told myself that she just needed time, that she would come around once she saw how serious I was about my dream. But as the months turned into years, it became clear that her doubts were more deeply rooted than I had ever imagined. Her father didn't help. From day one, Mr. Preston had made it clear that he didn't think I was good enough for his daughter. He had that polished businessman's charm, but underneath the handshake and the cordial smile was a man who measured worth in dollar signs and prestige. To him, I was a nobody, just a guy spinning his wheels with grand ideas that would never go anywhere. I could still remember his first words to me after I explained my plans for the restaurant. "That's nice, Max. But you know, dreams don't pay the bills." He said it casually, like he was giving me friendly advice. But I knew better. That was his way of putting me in my place. Alice didn't say much that day, but I could tell she agreed. Her silence spoke volumes. Over time, that silence became her trademark. Every time I talked about the progress I was making, how I'd managed to find a potential investor, or how I'd finally locked down a deal with a vendor, her responses were always the same. A small smile, a quick nod, and then, "That's nice, honey." It drove me crazy. I wasn't looking for a parade or a standing ovation, but some genuine excitement, some hint of pride, would have meant the world to me. Instead, I felt like I was shouting into a void, my words bouncing back at me with no impact. She'd never say it outright, but I knew she thought I was wasting my time. She saw my work as a pipe dream, something I'd tinker with, until I finally gave it up and got a real job. I hated the term real job. To Alice and her family, that meant a steady paycheck, a 401k, and a clear path up the corporate ladder. For me, it was a prison sentence. I'd tried that life before, clocking in, clocking out, living for the weekends. It had nearly killed my spirit. The restaurant was my way out, my way of taking control of my own future. But no matter how hard I tried to explain that to her, she never seemed to get it. Stacy was worse. If Alice's disinterest was subtle, Stacy's disdain was as blunt as a sledgehammer. Every family gathering was a fresh opportunity for her to throw a jab my way. She'd sidle up to me with that plastic smile of hers and say something like, "Still working on that little project of yours?" Her tone was always syrupy sweet, but the intent was clear. She didn't see me as a threat, just a joke. I tried not to let it get to me. I told myself she didn't matter, that her opinion was as shallow as her designer shoes. But damn, those comments had a way of burrowing under my skin. I wasn't doing this for her or for Alice's family, but every snide remark made it harder to keep going. It wasn't just about the words. It was the way they looked at me, like I was playing dress up in a world I didn't belong in. Stacy's fiancé, Tony, was the kind of guy they admired: sharp, confident, with a high-paying job in finance. He fit their mold. I didn't. And then there was Alice's mother. She wasn't as vocal as Mr. Preston or as openly cutting as Stacy, but her judgment was always there, lingering just beneath the surface. She'd smile politely when I talked, but her eyes would dart around the room, as if searching for something more interesting. I could almost hear her thoughts. When is this guy going to stop dreaming and start providing? The weight of their collective disapproval was suffocating. It was like I was carrying a boulder up a hill, only to have them add another stone every time I took a step. They didn't see the late nights, the sacrifices, the sheer willpower it took to keep going. They only saw what I didn't have: a fancy title, a big bank account, a name that carried weight in their world. It made me sick, but it also fueled me. Every dismissive comment, every judgmental glance, added another log to the fire burning inside me. I wasn't just chasing a dream. I was proving them wrong. I can still remember one particular family dinner at Alice's parents' house. Stacy was showing off pictures from her latest trip to Europe, and Alice's father was telling stories about his days as a young executive. The room was filled with laughter and the clink of wine glasses, but I felt like an outsider looking in. When they finally turned their attention to me, it was almost an afterthought. "So, Max," Mr. Preston said, leaning back in his chair. "How's the restaurant coming along? Any investors bite yet?" His tone was casual, but his words were loaded. Before I could answer, Stacy chimed in. "Oh, I'm sure he's got plenty of time to find investors," she said with a smirk. "It's not like he's in a rush. Right, Max?" The room erupted in polite laughter, and I forced a smile, swallowing the retort that was bubbling up in my throat. I wanted to tell them how close I was to opening. How I'd secured a partner who shared my vision. How I'd been working around the clock to make it happen. But I knew it wouldn't matter. They'd just smile and nod, and then go back to talking about Tony's latest promotion. So I kept quiet. I let them have their moment because I knew my time was coming. After dinner, Alice pulled me aside and said, "Don't let them get to you, Max. They just don't understand." She meant it as reassurance, but it only made me angrier. They didn't understand because she never tried to help them understand. She never stood up for me, never told them how hard I was working or how much progress I'd made. Instead, she just let their assumptions stand. It was easier that way, I guess. Easier than admitting that her husband wasn't the golden boy her father had always dreamed she'd marry. It hurt. It hurt more than I cared to admit. So I stopped trying to prove myself to them. I stopped looking for validation from people who would never give it. I focused on the work. Late nights, early mornings, weekends spent at the office instead of on the couch. I wasn't building a restaurant. I was building an empire, one piece at a time. Alice and her family didn't see it yet, but I knew what I was doing. I knew what I was capable of. And I knew that one day, they would see it too. But until that day came, I would keep my head down, keep grinding, and keep building. Because when it was all said and done, I didn't want their approval. I wanted their silence, the kind of silence that only comes when you've proven everyone wrong. So, do you think she realized what was coming? Or was she completely blindsided by the truth? Comment 1 if you think she saw it coming, or comment 2 if you think she had no idea. I'll be revealing everything next. Starting the restaurant wasn't just hard work, it was a war. It was like stepping onto a battlefield every single day, knowing the odds were stacked against me. I wasn't naive. I knew what I was up against. Banks wouldn't lend me money. Investors barely glanced at my proposals, and every vendor I approached looked at me like I was wasting their time. I'd never felt so invisible, so completely overlooked. I remember sitting at my desk in my tiny home office, surrounded by crumpled drafts of business plans and contracts that never went anywhere. It felt like I was drowning in rejection, each no hitting me like a wave. But I couldn't stop. I wouldn't stop. I told myself that every successful entrepreneur had been laughed at once, doubted by everyone around them. If I was going to join their ranks, I'd have to take the hits and keep moving forward. The first real breakthrough came from an old college friend, Matt. We'd lost touch over the years, but I heard he'd started his own small chain of coffee shops. When I reached out, I didn't expect much. Honestly, I was prepared for another polite dismissal. But Matt surprised me. He listened, really listened, as I laid out my vision. I talked about the kind of place I wanted to create, somewhere people could come not just for a meal, but for an experience. I told him about the menus I'd sketched out late at night, about the local suppliers I'd been researching, and about the hole in the market that I knew we could fill. Matt didn't laugh. He didn't roll his eyes. He nodded. And then he said something I hadn't heard in a long time. "I think you're onto something." For the first time in months, I felt a glimmer of hope. It wasn't just words, it was a spark, a sign that maybe, just maybe, someone believed in me. We started meeting regularly, sometimes in dingy diners, other times in his cramped office above one of his coffee shops. We went over the numbers, dissected every line of my business plan, and brainstormed ideas for how we could make this work. Matt brought a level of experience I didn't have, pointing out potential pitfalls and helping me tighten up the weak spots in my pitch. But it wasn't just his advice that made the difference, it was his attitude. He made me feel like this wasn't just a pipe dream, like it was something that could actually happen. That belief was contagious. The more he encouraged me, the harder I worked. I'd stay up until 2 or 3 in the morning, running numbers, tweaking the menu, researching competition. I poured everything I had into making this business a reality. The problem was, Alice didn't see it that way. While I was out meeting with Matt or making late-night phone calls to suppliers, Alice was home, scrolling through social media and dreaming about a life I couldn't give her. I'd come back exhausted, excited to share the progress I'd made, and she'd barely look up from her phone. "That's nice," she'd say, her tone as flat as the glow of the screen in her hand. It was soul-crushing. I wanted to scream, to shake her and make her see that I was doing this for us, for our future. But I didn't. I bit my tongue and kept pushing forward, telling myself that once the restaurant was open, she'd understand. Once she saw what I'd built, she'd realize that it was all worth it. As the weeks turned into months, things started to take shape. Matt and I found a potential location, a small, run-down spot that used to be a diner. The place was a mess. The floors were warped, the walls were covered in decades of grease stains, and the kitchen equipment looked like it hadn't been cleaned since the Reagan administration. But I saw the potential. I could picture the polished wood floors, the sleek tables, the open kitchen where diners could watch their meals come together. It wasn't just a restaurant in my mind, it was a haven. A place that would be as much about the atmosphere as the food. Matt was skeptical at first. "You sure you want to take this on?" he asked, looking around at the peeling paint and the cracked tile. But I was sure. I didn't just want it, I needed it. This was going to be my chance to prove everyone wrong. To show Alice and her family that I wasn't just some dreamer with nothing to show for it. Once we signed the lease, the real work began. Every day was a grind. I'd wake up at 6, drive to the diner, and spend hours tearing out old fixtures, scrubbing grease off the walls, and hauling out broken equipment. I didn't have money for a professional crew, so I did most of the work myself, with Matt helping out whenever he could. The physical labor was brutal. My hands were constantly blistered, my back ached every night, and my clothes were permanently stained with paint and cleaning chemicals. I'd never been so exhausted in my life. But I'd also never felt so alive. This was my place, my vision. Every inch of progress felt like a victory, even if it was just ripping out an old counter or getting a new coat of paint on the walls. The people around me didn't understand. Alice would complain that I was never home. Her parents would drop hints about how hard it must be to keep up with a project that seemed to have no end in sight. Stacy, of course, had her usual comments. "Wow, you're really doing all that work yourself? Hope you don't throw your back out before you even open." But I didn't care. Their words stung, sure, but they also fueled me. Every snide remark, every dismissive look made me more determined to succeed. There were nights when I wondered if I'd made a mistake. I'd sit in the middle of that half-gutted diner, surrounded by piles of scrap wood and broken tiles, and think about all the things I'd given up to get here. I'd think about the nights I missed at home, the tension that seemed to hang over every conversation with Alice, and the constant pressure of knowing that if I failed, I'd have nothing to show for all this effort. It was terrifying. But then I'd think about the moment when the doors would finally open, when customers would fill the tables, when the smell of perfectly cooked dishes would fill the air. That image kept me going. I could see it so clearly, like a lighthouse guiding me through the storm. When the diner was finally clean, and the first pieces of new equipment arrived, it felt like a turning point. I wasn't just cleaning up someone else's mess anymore. I was building something. The kitchen started to come together. The dining room began to take shape. Each step forward was like a small victory. I still had a long way to go, but for the first time, I felt like I was getting closer. This wasn't just a dream anymore. It was happening. I was making it happen. And even if no one else believed in me, I knew I couldn't stop now. I'd come too far to turn back. After the lease was signed, and we started tearing into the place, reality hit harder than I'd anticipated. The diner was a mess, sure, but I had thought the cleanup would be straightforward, a lot of sweat and elbow grease. But nothing I couldn't handle. Turns out, I was dead wrong. Every time we pulled something out, it seemed like 3 more problems popped up. The floors were rotted in places I hadn't noticed during our initial walkthrough. The electrical wiring was ancient, patched together like some 1950s DIY project. And the plumbing, God, the plumbing was a nightmare. Half the pipes were corroded, the other half barely functioning. We had water leaks we couldn't even locate. It felt like we were dismantling a Jenga tower that was already half collapsed. I remember standing there one evening, up to my knees in debris, staring at the exposed wiring in the ceiling, and thinking, what the hell have I gotten myself into? Every day was a new challenge. Matt and I were working practically around the clock, but we weren't making as much progress as we'd hoped. I'd get up at the crack of dawn, drive to the diner, and spend hours scrubbing, scraping, or hauling junk to the dumpster. By the time I'd head home, it'd be dark outside, and I'd be too exhausted to eat, let alone have a meaningful conversation with Alice. Not that she was waiting up for me. Most nights, I'd find her asleep on the couch with the TV still on. She never asked how the work was going, never wanted to know what I'd accomplished that day. At first, I tried to tell her anyway, to keep her in the loop, but her blank expression and mumbled responses made it clear that she didn't care. She just saw me as the guy who wasn't home anymore. The guy who wasn't making enough money. The guy who had chosen a crumbling diner over her. The truth is, I was burning the candle at both ends. The long days at the site were brutal. I'd spend hours pulling out old fixtures, covered in grime and sweat, only to have contractors show up and tell me it had cost more than we'd budgeted to fix the damage we'd uncovered. And when I wasn't physically tearing the place apart, I was on the phone, juggling vendors who wanted deposits up front or chasing down paperwork that never seemed to be in the right place at the right time. It felt like every step forward was met with 2 steps back. There were moments when I wanted to throw in the towel, moments when the idea of walking away and cutting my losses seemed a lot easier than pushing forward. But then I'd remember why I started all this in the first place. I wasn't just doing this for me. I was doing it to prove to Alice, her family, and most importantly myself, that I wasn't the nobody they thought I was. There were nights when I'd be up at 2 in the morning, staring at spreadsheets, trying to figure out how I was going to stretch my dwindling funds to cover another month's rent. I'd feel the weight of it all pressing down on me, the bills piling up, the contractor's endless estimates, the silence at home. It wasn't just about the money. It was the feeling that I was constantly on the verge of failure, like one more setback might finally break me. I'd lie awake, my mind racing through worst-case scenarios. What if I couldn't finish the renovations? What if we never opened? What if Alice walked out for good? Every worry felt like a stone in my chest, making it harder and harder to breathe. But somehow, each morning, I'd get up, put on my work clothes, and head back to that diner. Matt was a lifeline during those dark days. He'd show up after closing one of his coffee shops, still smelling like roasted beans, and dive into whatever project needed the most hands. We'd work side by side, sweating through our shirts, barely speaking. Sometimes he'd crack a joke, something stupid, something that wouldn't normally be funny, but in those moments, it was exactly what I needed to hear. He'd remind me that every great business had a messy start, that every successful entrepreneur had stories of sleepless nights and impossible odds. "This is the shit you'll laugh about one day," he'd say, standing knee-deep in shattered tile. "You'll look back and tell your grandkids, you think your job's hard? Let me tell you about the time I found a rat's nest in the ceiling." I'd laugh, half because it was funny, half because I needed to believe it was true. I needed to believe that all this pain and frustration was building towards something greater. But no matter how hard I worked or how much progress we made, I couldn't shake the feeling that Alice had already given up on me. I'd catch her scrolling through Instagram, liking pictures of Stacy's lavish life, fancy dinners, designer clothes, exotic vacations. She never posted about the diner, never told her friends about the work I was doing. To her, it didn't seem worth mentioning. I started to feel like a ghost in my own home. When I did manage to sit down with her, the conversations felt hollow. She'd nod politely when I mentioned how the floor was finally level, or how we'd replaced the ancient plumbing. But there was no enthusiasm, no pride. Her eyes would drift back to her phone, and the moment would slip away. I tried to tell myself that once the place was finished, once we opened and people saw what I'd built, everything would change. She'd see that it had all been worth it. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was true. I spent every ounce of energy I had trying to make that diner into the restaurant I'd always dreamed of. I didn't care how long it took or how much it cost. This was my shot. The hours blurred together: early mornings scraping old paint off the walls, late nights cleaning grease traps and patching drywall. My body ached constantly. My hands were rough and blistered. But I didn't stop. I couldn't stop. I'd remind myself that this wasn't just about opening a restaurant. It was about proving that I could do it. Proving that I wasn't the man Alice's father thought I was. It was about showing her and myself that I could create something from nothing. Something real. Something that mattered. And no matter how many setbacks I faced, no matter how many times I felt like giving up, I kept pushing forward. Because at the end of the day, this wasn't just a restaurant. It was my redemption. By the time we'd gutted the place and finally started putting it back together, I could feel a shift happening, subtle, but there. The once rotten floors had been stripped down and reinforced. The grease-covered walls were now freshly painted, the kind of deep, warm tones that made you want to sit down and stay a while. The cracked, filthy windows had been replaced with clean, clear panes that let in natural light. I could see the space coming to life, could picture the tables full of customers, the sound of clinking glasses, the murmur of conversation. It wasn't finished, not by a long shot, but for the first time, it felt real. Like a restaurant, not a junkyard. And as those changes took shape, something else started to change too. People noticed. It started with little things. A neighbor would pass by while I was hauling trash out to the dumpster and call out, "Looks like you've got your hands full there." The guy delivering a fresh batch of supplies would linger for an extra minute, glancing around and saying, "You know, it's starting to look pretty good in here." Those moments might have seemed insignificant, but to me, they were everything. It was proof that what we were doing mattered, that all those long nights and early mornings were starting to pay off. People were seeing the transformation. They weren't just looking at a rundown old diner anymore. They were starting to see the vision I'd carried in my head for so long. It wasn't just strangers either. A few old friends I hadn't spoken to in years started reaching out. One night, I got a message from a buddy I hadn't seen since high school. "Heard you're opening a restaurant," he wrote. "That's awesome, man. Can't wait to check it out when it's done." That hit me harder than I expected. I didn't realize how much I'd missed that sense of connection, of having someone root for me. For so long, it felt like it was just Matt and me against the world. I'd gotten used to the idea that most people didn't care what I was doing, or worse, thought I'd never pull it off. But now, slowly, people were starting to believe. I wasn't alone anymore. Even Alice couldn't ignore it. One evening, as I came home covered in paint and dust, she looked up from her phone and actually asked, "How's it going over there?" I stared at her for a moment, not sure if I'd heard her right. "It's going well," I said, my voice cautious. She nodded, almost to herself, and then added, "I saw a couple of pictures on Facebook. It looks nice." Nice. It wasn't much, but coming from Alice, it was practically a standing ovation. She didn't say anything else, just went back to scrolling on her phone, but it stayed with me. It was the first time in years she'd shown any interest in what I was doing. It gave me hope that maybe, when this was all done, she'd see what I'd accomplished and finally understand why I'd worked so damn hard. But even as things started to come together, I couldn't let myself get too comfortable. There was still so much to do. Every day brought a new challenge, a new problem to solve. The stove we'd bought on sale turned out to be missing a crucial part. The first batch of tables we ordered arrived scratched and scuffed. The health inspector came by and flagged a vent system we thought we'd fixed. It was always something. And yet, I could feel myself changing. The setbacks didn't crush me like they used to. I'd gotten stronger mentally, emotionally. I could take a hit and keep going. I'd learned to adapt, to find solutions instead of dwelling on the problems. Maybe it was the pressure of having come this far, or maybe it was the knowledge that people were finally starting to believe in me. Either way, I wasn't the same man I was when I started. What surprised me most was how I started to enjoy the work. Not all of it, of course. I still hated dealing with the endless paperwork and negotiating with suppliers who always seemed to want more money than I had. But the actual hands-on part, painting the walls, laying down the flooring, installing the light fixtures, those moments felt good. They were tangible. I could step back at the end of the day, look at what we'd done, and think, yeah, we're getting there. It was satisfying in a way I hadn't expected. For so long, I'd been chasing this dream, and now I was finally living it. Every nail driven, every tile laid brought me one step closer to opening those doors and welcoming people in. And that's what kept me going. The image of that opening night. I'd pictured it so many times. The table set with crisp white linens, the smell of the food wafting out from the kitchen, the sound of music playing softly in the background. I could see it all so clearly. I could see customers walking in, looking around, smiling as they took in the warm lighting, the polished wood floors, the open kitchen. I could see them enjoying their meals, telling their friends, coming back again and again. That's what I held on to. That vision, that future, was what kept me from giving up. It made every setback worth it, every long day and sleepless night bearable. I wasn't just building a restaurant. I was building a place that people would love. And for the first time, it felt like I wasn't alone in believing that. The world around me was starting to catch on. And that was the best feeling in the world. There was a moment when I realized I was running out of time. The money I'd saved, every last dollar I'd scraped together, was nearly gone. The pressure was mounting, and the walls were closing in. Every morning, I'd wake up with this gnawing sense of urgency, like a clock ticking louder and louder in the back of my mind. I'd try to shake it off, telling myself that things were coming together, that we were close. But the truth was, I couldn't afford another major setback. Every penny mattered. Every day mattered. If we didn't open soon, it would all be over. I'd lose everything. We were down to the final stretch, just a few more weeks until the grand opening. That's what I kept telling myself. A few more weeks, just a little longer, and we'll make it. But those weeks felt like a lifetime. The days blurred together, each one filled with an endless list of tasks that couldn't wait. The kitchen equipment was in place, but the menus weren't printed. The tables were set, but the chairs still needed repairs. The permits were approved, but the staff was untrained. I was constantly juggling 100 different things, always wondering which one would fall apart first. And with each passing day, the weight on my shoulders grew heavier. I'd worked so hard to get here, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it might all come crashing down at the last second. Even Matt was starting to show signs of doubt. He didn't say it outright, he was too good a friend for that, but I could see it in his face, in the way he hesitated before answering my questions. "Do you think we'll make it?" I'd ask, and he'd nod, but his smile didn't reach his eyes. It wasn't that he didn't believe in me. I think he just knew how high the stakes were. He'd been through the ringer with his own businesses, and he knew how fragile success could be. I appreciated his honesty, but it didn't make things any easier. In fact, it made it harder. If even Matt wasn't sure we'd pull this off, what hope did I have? Alice's attitude hadn't changed much either. She was still distant, still wrapped up in her own world. I'd come home late at night, covered in sweat and sawdust, and she'd barely look up. "How's it going?" she'd ask, her tone more out of politeness than genuine curiosity. "It's fine," I'd reply, not wanting to get into it. What was the point? She wasn't going to help, and I didn't have the energy to argue. I'd grab a quick bite to eat, take a shower, and collapse into bed, only to wake up a few hours later and do it all over again. This wasn't the life I'd imagined when I started this journey. I'd thought opening a restaurant would bring us closer together, but instead, it felt like we were drifting further apart. The nights were the worst. That's when the doubts crept in. Lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, I'd replay every decision I'd made, wondering where I'd gone wrong. Should I have chosen a different location? Hired different contractors? Spent more on advertising? I couldn't turn my brain off. The stress was relentless. I'd close my eyes, hoping for just a few hours of rest. But all I could think about was the bills that were piling up, the deadlines that were looming, and the possibility that I'd wake up one day and find it was all over. I didn't want to admit it, not to Alice, not to Matt, not even to myself, but I was scared. Scared of failing. Scared of losing everything I'd worked so hard for. Scared that all those late nights and early mornings would amount to nothing. But I couldn't let that fear show. Not to the crew, not to the vendors, not to the few friends who were still rooting for me. They looked to me for direction, for confidence, and I had to deliver. Even when I felt like I was falling apart inside, I had to put on a brave face. "We're almost there," I'd say, clapping a cook on the back or shaking a server's hand. "Just a few more days, and we'll be ready to open." They'd nod, smile, and get back to work. I don't know if they believed me, but I needed them to keep going. I needed them to see this through. The closer we got to opening day, the more intense the pressure became. It felt like walking a tightrope with no safety net. One wrong move, and I'd fall. But there was no turning back now. I'd come too far, worked too hard, sacrificed too much. Failure wasn't an option. I had to believe that. I had to keep telling myself that this was going to work, even when every instinct was screaming that it wouldn't. Because if I didn't believe in myself, who else would? I kept pushing, kept fighting. I thought about the people who doubted me, Alice's father, Stacy, even Alice herself. I thought about all the times I'd been written off, dismissed as a dreamer with no real plan. That anger, that resentment, fueled me. It gave me the strength to keep going when I wanted to quit. I wasn't just building a restaurant. I was proving them wrong. I was showing them that I was more than they thought I was. That's what kept me going. That's what kept me fighting, even when it felt like the whole world was against me. I remember standing in the dining room one evening, just after we'd finished setting up the tables. The sun was setting outside, casting a warm orange glow through the windows. For a moment, I let myself imagine what it would be like when the restaurant was full, customers laughing, plates clinking, the smell of food filling the air. I could almost hear the sound of glasses being raised in toast. It felt so real, so close. And in that moment, I knew I couldn't give up. I couldn't let all of this work go to waste. I had to keep going, no matter how hard it got, no matter how tired I was. Because if I could just make it through these final weeks, I'd have something no one could take away from me. I'd have my restaurant. I'd have my dream. And maybe, just maybe, I'd finally have their respect. The night before the grand opening, I couldn't sleep. I really tried, but every time I closed my eyes, my mind raced through everything that could go wrong. I was lying there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, feeling the weight of months of work pressing down on me. There were so many details I'd gone over, so many decisions I'd made. What if I'd missed something? What if the kitchen wasn't ready, or the servers forgot their training, or the suppliers didn't deliver on time? The what ifs were endless. I knew I needed rest, that tomorrow would be one of the most important days of my life. But my brain refused to shut off. So, after hours of tossing and turning, I finally gave up. I got out of bed, grabbed my car keys, and drove back to the restaurant. When I arrived, the place was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the street lamp outside. I unlocked the front door, stepped inside, and stood there for a moment, letting the silence wash over me. It was almost surreal. For so long, this had been a chaotic construction zone, filled with the noise of drills, the smell of sawdust, and the constant hustle of contractors. But now, it was quiet. The tables were set, the floors were polished, and the kitchen was spotless. Everything looked perfect, but instead of feeling proud, I felt nervous, almost sick. I walked through the dining room, checking every little detail again. I adjusted the chairs, straightened the silverware, and wiped down the already clean tables. It wasn't that anything was out of place, I just needed something to do. Anything to keep my hands busy, to keep the doubt at bay. As I moved through the room, I thought about Alice. I wondered if she would show up tomorrow. She hadn't said much about the opening, barely mentioned it, actually. I knew she was busy with Stacy's engagement plans, but part of me hoped that when she saw the restaurant, saw what I'd built, she'd finally understand why I'd been working so hard. Maybe she'd see me differently. Maybe she'd be proud. But deep down, I wasn't sure if that was ever going to happen. The distance between us had grown so wide, and I wasn't sure if this place, no matter how beautiful or successful, could bridge that gap. I found myself in the kitchen, running my fingers over the shiny new counters, checking the equipment one last time. The oven lights glowed softly, the stainless steel surfaces gleamed, and the shelves were stocked with ingredients. It was ready. I had done everything I could, and now it was out of my hands. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that I had forgotten something. My stomach was in knots, my chest tight. I leaned against the counter, staring at the empty space, and whispered to myself, "You've got this, it's going to be fine." But even as I said it, I didn't believe it. Not really. The hours dragged on, and before I knew it, the sky outside began to lighten. I watched the first rays of sunlight filter through the windows, casting a golden glow over the dining room. It was almost time. I went into the bathroom, splashed cold water on my face, and looked at myself in the mirror. I looked tired, exhausted. Really, but there was something else in my reflection. Determination. I had come too far, worked too hard, to let fear get the better of me now. This was my chance to prove to everyone, Alice, her family, the doubters, and most importantly, myself, that I could do this. I straightened up, took a deep breath, and headed back out into the dining room. The staff started to trickle in shortly after. I could see the nervous energy in their faces as they walked through the door. Most of them were young, inexperienced, and just as uncertain as I was. But I put on a confident smile and greeted each one, shaking hands, cracking a few jokes to lighten the mood. "This is it," I told them. "All the hard work you've put in, it's going to pay off today. We're ready." I could see them relax a little, nodding and smiling back. They needed to believe it, and in that moment, I realized I needed them to believe it, too. If they had confidence, maybe I could borrow some of it. The morning was a whirlwind. Final deliveries arrived, and we scrambled to put everything in place. The line cooks were busy prepping, chopping vegetables, seasoning meats, and setting up their stations. The servers ran through their final training, making sure they knew the menu inside and out. I moved through the restaurant, answering questions, solving last-minute problems, and doing my best to keep everyone calm. On the surface, I looked composed, but inside, I was a wreck. My heart was pounding, my palms were sweaty, and my mind raced with every possible scenario. But there was no time for doubt now. We had to open. Ready or not, this was happening. As the clock inched closer to opening time, I found myself standing by the front door, staring at the empty sidewalk outside. The sun was high in the sky, the weather perfect, and I wondered who would be the first to walk through those doors. Would it be someone from the neighborhood, curious to see what all the commotion had been about these past few months? A couple out for lunch, looking for a new place to try? I had no idea. But I knew one thing, whoever it was, they would be stepping into something I had built from nothing. Something I had poured my heart and soul into. The time finally came. I took a deep breath, unlocked the door, and stepped aside as the first customers walked in. My chest tightened as I watched them look around, taking in the warm lighting, the elegant decor, the open kitchen. I saw their faces light up, heard their murmurs of approval, and felt a surge of relief. We had done it. We were open. I greeted them with a smile, led them to their table, and handed them menus. My hands were still trembling, but I kept my voice steady. "Welcome. I hope you enjoy your meal." They nodded, smiled back, and thanked me. As more customers filed in, the restaurant filled with the sounds I dreamed of: laughter, conversation, the clinking of silverware against plates. The staff moved with purpose, delivering dishes, refilling drinks, and making sure everyone was comfortable. The kitchen was humming, the line cooks working like a well-oiled machine. It wasn't perfect, there were a few hiccups. A couple of orders that took longer than expected, but for the most part, it was running smoothly. I walked through the dining room, checking on tables, chatting with customers, and soaking it all in. This was it. This was what I'd been working toward. For the first time in months, I felt a sense of pride. This wasn't just a dream anymore. It was real. I could see it, hear it, feel it. All the sleepless nights, the endless worries, the sacrifices, it had all been worth it. I still didn't know if Alice would ever see that, if she'd ever truly understand. But as I looked around the room, at the smiling faces, the staff working hard, and the plates of food being enjoyed, I realized something important. I didn't need her approval. I didn't need anyone's. I had built this. I had made it happen, and that was enough. As the day went on, the tension in the air was almost unbearable. The steady hum of conversation from the customers, the clinking of silverware, the occasional burst of laughter, it all felt like a facade, like the calm before a storm I couldn't yet see. I walked through the dining room, checking on tables, forcing a smile, my mind racing. Everything had gone well, so far better than I expected. Honestly, but I couldn't relax. I couldn't let my guard down. I kept waiting for something to go wrong. A power outage. A kitchen fire. A dish sent back cold. My nerves were frayed, and every little sound felt magnified. Every small gesture from the staff seemed like it could snowball into a disaster. I knew I had to keep my composure. Had to act confident so the staff wouldn't sense my anxiety. But I felt like I was hanging on by a thread. At one point, I stopped by a table near the window, where a middle-aged couple was sharing a bottle of wine. They were smiling, their voices low, their plates nearly empty. The man looked up at me, his eyes warm. "Everything's perfect," he said, raising his glass. "You've got a real gem here." I thanked him, managed a polite nod, and moved on, but his words didn't comfort me the way I thought they would. If anything, they made my chest tighten even more. Perfect. That's what he said. But what if it wasn't? What if someone else, at another table, wasn't enjoying their meal? What if someone left here tonight and wrote a scathing review, warning everyone to stay away? My mind refused to settle, spiraling into worst-case scenarios. I knew I was being irrational. I knew I should be savoring the moment, soaking in the compliments, but I couldn't. All I could think about was the pressure, the weight of it all. The stakes were too high for me to fail. In the kitchen, things seemed to be running smoothly, or at least, that's what I told myself. The line cooks were focused, moving in synchronized precision. And the head chef, Carla, was barking orders like a seasoned general. The steam from the pots and pans rose up, creating a thin haze in the air, and the sizzle of steaks on the grill blended with the sound of knives on cutting boards. I stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching it all, my hands clenched at my sides. Carla noticed me, and gave a quick thumbs up before turning back to the grill. She looked confident, in control, like she had everything handled. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I should be doing more. That if I took my eyes off the kitchen, even for a second, something would go wrong. Back in the dining room, I saw Matt talking to one of the servers near the bar. He caught my eye and gave me a quick grin, his way of telling me everything was fine. But even that wasn't enough. I couldn't let myself believe it. I found myself pacing between tables, adjusting chairs, checking the time on my watch, then checking it again. I felt like I was standing on a tightrope, one wrong move away from falling. I kept thinking about all the people who doubted me: Alice, her father, Stacy. They weren't here tonight, but their voices echoed in my mind. "He'll never pull it off. He's just a dreamer. It's a waste of time." Those words fueled me, pushed me to keep going, but they also haunted me. If I failed tonight, I'd prove them right. I couldn't let that happen. As the evening rush began to taper off, I allowed myself a small breath of relief. The servers were still busy, the kitchen was still humming, but the initial chaos had eased. I stopped by the bar to grab a glass of water, my throat dry, my hands trembling slightly. The bartender, a young guy named Derek, gave me a quick smile. "Hell of a night, huh?" he said. I nodded, taking a sip of water. "Yeah," I replied, my voice hoarse. Hell of a night. But even as I said it, my mind was already jumping ahead, thinking about the next hurdle, the next challenge. The opening day was almost over, but the restaurant's future was still uncertain. Tonight was just one step. I knew that, but I couldn't help feeling like everything depended on it. As the final tables began to clear, I took another slow walk through the dining room. The chairs were being pushed back in, the silverware gathered up. I noticed a young couple still sitting by the far wall, finishing up their dessert. They looked happy, leaning close to each other, talking softly. I watched them for a moment, my mind drifting. This was why I'd started this whole thing. This was what I wanted: a place where people could come together, share a meal, and create memories. I wanted to give people an experience, something special. Seeing them smile, seeing them enjoy what I'd built, gave me a flicker of hope. Maybe I hadn't completely lost my mind chasing this dream. Maybe it was worth it. But just as I started to let that thought settle, the kitchen door swung open, and Carla rushed out, a look of panic on her face. "We're out of the duck," she said, her voice urgent. My stomach dropped. "How?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. "We just got that order in yesterday." She shook her head, clearly stressed. "I don't know. There was an inventory mix-up." We don't have enough for the last 2 tables. I felt my pulse quicken, the panic rising again. Can we substitute something? Anything? I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. Carla nodded, already turning back toward the kitchen. I'll make it work, she said, disappearing through the door. I stood there for a moment, trying to calm my breathing. It wasn't a disaster, not yet. But it was a reminder that no matter how much I prepared, no matter how hard I worked, there were always going to be things I couldn't control. I had to accept that. I had to trust my team, trust Carla, trust the staff. But letting go was easier said than done. I was still on edge, still waiting for the next thing to go wrong. When the night finally ended, I stood by the door, watching the last customers leave. They waved, smiled, said they'd be back. I forced a smile and waved back, but inside, I felt like I'd just run a marathon. The dining room was quiet now, the lights dimmed. The staff was cleaning up, talking quietly among themselves. I leaned against the doorframe, my body heavy with exhaustion. It was over. The first night was over. We'd made it through without any major disasters, but my nerves were shot. I'd spent so much time worrying, so much time on edge, that I couldn't even feel the relief I thought I would. I looked around the empty room, the clean tables, the polished floors, and tried to find a sense of accomplishment. It was there, somewhere. I just had to let it in. By the time the last customers walked out the door, the restaurant was quiet again. The air felt thick, like all the tension from the day had settled into the walls, into the floors, into me. I watched my staff wrap up their duties, each of them moving slower now, their adrenaline finally wearing off. The initial rush was over, the chaos had subsided, and it was only then that I realized how bone-tired I really was. My back ached, my legs felt like lead, and my head was still buzzing from hours of high-stakes decisions. I leaned against the bar, looking out over the dining room, and tried to process what had just happened. The night had been a success. I knew that. The customers were happy, the food was good, and the service had been smooth for the most part. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing, some piece of satisfaction, some sense of accomplishment that I thought I'd feel once we got through that first night. I kept replaying the events in my head, looking for the moment when it would all click, when I'd be able to say, "This is what I worked so hard for." Instead, I just felt empty. Not defeated, exactly, but not triumphant either. Just drained. As the staff started filing out, offering me tired but genuine smiles, I thanked them. "Good job tonight," I said, shaking hands, clapping them on the back. "You all did great. Go get some rest." They nodded, murmuring their thanks, and one by one they left until it was just me standing there, the sound of the door closing behind them echoing in the stillness. I looked around the room, my restaurant, and took a deep breath. The tables were empty. Now, the lights dimmed, the polished wood floors gleaming faintly under the soft glow of the sconces. It was exactly how I'd imagined it, and yet, it wasn't. Something about it felt distant, like it belonged to someone else. I ran a hand through my hair and sighed. I thought about Alice. I thought about all the nights I'd come home late, covered in dust and sweat, trying to tell her about the progress we were making. I thought about how she'd barely looked up from her phone, how she'd nodded absent-mindedly, or changed the subject. I'd told myself it didn't matter, that I didn't need her approval to keep going. But now, standing here alone, I realized how much I'd hoped she'd show up tonight. Just once, I wanted her to see what I'd built. To see me as someone who had made it, who had followed through on a promise to himself. But she wasn't here, she'd never even mentioned coming. Her absence felt heavy, but it wasn't just Alice. It was everything. It was all the times I'd been dismissed, all the doubts I'd carried, all the moments when I'd wanted to give up but didn't. I'd spent so long trying to prove myself, trying to prove to her family, to the people who doubted me, that I'd never stopped to ask what proving it would even look like. Was it this? This empty dining room, this quiet sense of accomplishment that felt more like relief than joy? I didn't know. I wandered into the kitchen, where the stainless steel counters were spotless. The pans were hung neatly on their racks, and the sinks were scrubbed clean. The scent of the night's dishes still lingered: rosemary, garlic, a hint of lemon. I traced my fingers along the edge of the prep table, remembering the frenzy of activity just hours earlier. Carla had been incredible, keeping the line moving, calling out orders with the kind of authority I could only dream of. She'd made the impossible seem easy, but now it was quiet. The kitchen was empty, and I felt like I was standing in the aftermath of something bigger than myself. Something I couldn't fully grasp. I leaned against the counter and stared at the floor. All I'd ever wanted was to build something of my own. Something real. I'd imagined this night so many times, customers laughing, plates coming out of the kitchen perfectly timed, servers gliding through the room with confidence. I'd imagined the feeling of pride, of knowing that I'd created something people loved. And it had happened. They'd loved it. They'd told me so. But the feeling I'd imagined, the deep, soul-satisfying pride, I couldn't find it. Instead, I just felt tired. Like I'd crossed a finish line and realized the race wasn't over, that there was another, longer race waiting just beyond it. I walked out the back door into the cool night air. The street was quiet, the lights from the lampposts casting long shadows on the pavement. I leaned against the brick wall and looked up at the stars, faint and distant against the city's glow. For the first time in hours, I allowed myself to just breathe. I let the cool air fill my lungs, let the tension in my shoulders ease, let my mind stop spinning. I stood there, alone in the dark, and tried to figure out what I felt. There was relief, certainly. Relief that the night had gone well, that the customers had left happy, that no major disasters had unfolded. There was pride, too, buried under the exhaustion, a quiet, steady pride that I'd done it, that I'd built this place with my own hands. But there was also something else, something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't sadness, exactly. Maybe it was just the weight of everything that had led up to this moment, the years of struggle, the nights of self-doubt, the distance that had grown between me and Alice. It was all still there, lingering just beneath the surface. I didn't know if it would ever really go away. But as I stood there, staring up at the stars, I felt something shift. I realized that this wasn't the end. This wasn't the moment when everything was supposed to feel perfect. This was just the beginning. The restaurant was open now, but the work wasn't over. There would be more nights like this, more challenges, more moments of doubt. And maybe that was okay. Maybe the point wasn't to reach some perfect moment of triumph, but to keep going, to keep building, to keep trying. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew one thing: I wasn't done yet. I pushed off the wall and headed back inside. The dining room was still quiet, the chairs neatly arranged, the table set for the next day. I walked through the space slowly, taking it all in. This was mine. I'd built it. And for now, that was enough. I turned off the lights, locked the doors, and stepped back out into the night. The city was calm, the streets empty, the world still. I took a deep breath, squared my shoulders, and started walking. It wasn't the ending I'd imagined, but it was a beginning. And sometimes that's all you need. And there you have it, the shocking revelation that changed everything. So, what do you think? Was it worth it? Did the outcome surprise you? Don't forget to like, comment, and share your thoughts. I'm curious to hear what you would have done in my shoes. Stay tuned for more stories that will keep you on the edge of your seat. Success isn't about how others see you. It's about how you see yourself. I spent years chasing approval from people who doubted me, trying to prove them wrong. But what I learned is that the real victory comes from staying true to your own vision, your own hard work. If you believe in yourself and keep pushing forward no matter the odds, you'll find pride and fulfillment that no one can take away. In this country, we value determination, resilience, and ambition. Those qualities, more than anything else, define success. So trust yourself, work hard, and let your efforts speak for themselves.